to look at how the reforms cumulatively have impacted on different sorts of households. First of all, let's just look at the numbers affected by the different elements of the reforms and how much the average financial loss can be expected to be. You've got incapacity benefit reform and disability living allowance reform affecting really quite substantial numbers and to substantial amounts, around about £2,000 a year typically being the loss. But how does this all work out cumulatively in terms of impacting on different households? This particular table is probably the most important table in the presentation, because it shows how the reforms can be expected to work out in terms of their impact on different types of households. There were 15 different types of households in that list, and all of Scotland's 2.6 million households can be slotted into one or other of those 15 different categories. Towards the bottom of that list, there's quite a group which is other. Relatively small numbers in those categories, I've got to say. They tend to be households with rather complex structures. For example, where you may have a parent and a child still living with the child's grandparent, where you've got non-standard family units. Some types of households escape very lightly on average, and others are hit much, much harder. Number of points to note. Firstly, pensioner households barely touched by the welfare reforms. To be impacted by the reforms as a pensioner, you've really got to be either living in the private rented sector and claiming housing benefit, which relatively few pensioners do, or you've perhaps got to be in the slightly unusual position of being over state pension age and still claiming child benefit. Another group that escapes unscathed from the reforms are student households, because students really have very, very little, if any, entitlement to welfare benefits. Households with dependent children are hit hard. Couples with one or two or more dependent children, average losses in excess of £1,400 a year. Lone parents, even larger financial losses. It's caused us to look at why this is actually happening. So, and I'm looking at the share of households in those categories that are hit by each element of the welfare reforms. Now, you look at the column there for lone parents with one child. They're all hit by the freeze in the value of child benefit. They're all hit by the 1% uprating. 81%, I mean 4 in 5, are hit by reductions in tax credits. The housing benefit reforms in the private rented sector hit 14%, that's 1 in 7. The incapacity benefit reforms hit 1 in 10 lone parent households with a child. The disability allowance, living allowance reforms hit a further 7%, and so on. Whereas you can see that for couples with no children, the percentages of those types of households hit by each element of the reforms, on average, is significantly less. Now, this is not to say that in those households that are hit, those couples that are hit by incapacity benefit reforms or disability allowance, living allowance reforms, it's not to say that those households don't face large financial losses. They do face large losses, but on average, lone parents or indeed couples with dependent children are more likely to be hit by multiple elements of the financial reforms. Putting all this together, figures suggest that around about 2/3 or £960 million a year of the total financial loss is falling on households with dependent children. About 40% or £600 million a year is falling on the sick or disabled via DLA and incapacity benefit reforms. And those groups also lose from all the other elements of the reform package too. And around about half of the financial loss is falling on in-work households. Don't add up those figures together, but there is overlap between those groups. 2/3 hitting households with dependent children, about 40% hitting the sick and disabled, around half hitting in-work households. Are things worse in Scotland than in Great Britain as a whole? Not really. The social security regulations are the same in both countries. But if you look carefully down the Scottish column compared with the GB column, you will see that in a number of categories, the financial hit in Scotland is actually slightly less than the GB average. And that reflects the fact that up here in Scotland, you've found ways of averting the reductions in council tax benefit, and indeed you've averted the impact of the bedroom tax. There are, of course, differences between places in Scotland as well. And I thought it was worth pulling out the contrasts between Glasgow and Edinburgh. In both cities, on average, couples, lone parents with dependent children face big financial losses, but the financial losses are larger in Glasgow than in Edinburgh, on average. And that reflects the fact that the welfare benefit claimant rate is higher in Glasgow than in Edinburgh. This may look like a tale of woe, in some respects it is, but will it be all right on the night? Are we really setting the alarm bells ringing unnecessarily? Of course, Westminster ministers say that the welfare reforms will incentivise individuals to find work. If people look for work, they will find work, and therefore the loss of benefit income will be offset by additional earnings. Well, you do need to bear in mind one or 2 points. Firstly, it's always been the case that the vast majority of claimants were already financially better off in work than on benefits, so there's nothing new about the incentive to be better off by working, though there's no doubt the welfare reforms do increase that incentive. You also need to bear in mind that actually out-of-work claimants do tend to have low skills and poor health, so they're not going to be employers' first choice. And then there is the obvious question, well, where are all of these additional jobs that people are going to go to? I can perhaps see that in certain prosperous local economies, particularly in southern England, though maybe in 1 or 2 parts of Scotland, additional labour supply triggered by the welfare reforms may lead to employers taking on extra individuals, and the overall level of employment might be somewhat higher. There's a generalisation. I suspect that doesn't really fit Scotland very well, and I'd be enormously surprised if the reforms did result in significantly higher levels of employment.